Friend Chris Anderson. Chris is an assistant professor of media culture at the College of Staten Island, which is part of the City University of New York. Chris did his PhD at Columbia in the School of Journalism. He is, to my mind at least, and I guess I can be unbiased because digital journalism is not my direct field, one of the most interesting young scholars today doing work at the intersection of changes in media technologies and changes in journalistic practice. And he does so, I think, as we'll hear a little bit more, through a historical lens. So just a couple more quick notes about Chris. He has a book coming out called Networking the News, The Struggle to Rebuild Metropolitan Journalism from 1997 to 2012. Chris traces the history of the uptake of digital media in journalism. And he does so through the lens of 3 metropolitan Philadelphia newspapers, where he spent 3 years doing ethnographic research inside their newsrooms. And I can say I read an early version of the manuscript, and it's brilliant. And that will be out in the fall by Temple University Press. Chris's work has also appeared in a number of other publications, including Political Communication, International Journal of Communication, and Journalism Theory, Practice, and Criticism. With that, I will hand this over to Chris.
Okay. Great, thanks, Dan. So I'm going to make sure. How do I move these slides? Is this the guy that I should use? This one on the right? No. Could hit the mouse. Is that a better way to do it? Oh, there we go. Aha. Okay. So it did move forward. All right. Well, bear with me here with, talking about digital journalism, there are always going to be technical difficulties of some sort. Thanks to University of North Carolina School of Journalism and Mass Communications to inviting me. Thanks to Dan for being a fantastic host. I really appreciate being here on what looks like a beautiful couple days. So I just want to warn everyone sort of ahead of time, this is very much a work in progress. I'm sort of in one of those moments where I have finished a previous project, I am beginning a new project. I told Dan earlier that kind of every talk I give is now a new talk because I haven't quite settled on exactly what I'm doing yet. So I ask your indulgence. I hope you will have lots of feedback and questions and criticisms and thoughts from me at the end. So on that note, the title of the talk is The Long History of Data Journalism, Reporting Social Science and Document Analysis. And I'll get to what I mean by sort of long history, by data journalism, by reporting social science and documents. Each one of those words will sort of be explicated over the course of the talk. There we go. So in a study of Washington correspondence in the 1980s, Stephen Hess, who is a former correspondent himself and then a researcher, analyzed 3,967 interviews for 865 stories in the 1980s in the Washington news. And he came up with this basic finding. Washington reporters, Washington, D.C. reporters use no documents in the preparation of nearly 3/4 of their stories. So in 3/4 of the stories that correspondents in Washington, D.C. produce, they use documents in only 25% of them. And they use no documents at all in 75%. He did not actually, by the way, include press releases in that study, which would sort of change the data in interesting ways. But this primarily means what? This means that the majority of journalistic stories emerged from interviews, emerged from human sources, and to a lesser degree emerged from some sort of first-hand observation. And this finding by Hess from 1981 about the sort of unimportance or the relative unimportance of documents has been cited a number of times sort of in the sociology of news literature, many, many times actually from 1981 till the present day, plays a prominent role in Michael Schudson's sort of analysis of the sociology of news, and it has been cited since then many times. And the question I'm interested in this talk and in my larger research project is, what if this finding is changing? What if this basic finding about the use of documents and documentary evidence in the production of journalistic work is changing? Or another question to ask is, what if it is changing and not in a quantitative sense, right? What if it is changing not in the sense of more reporters are using documents, right? What if it's roughly still 75% to 25%? But what if it's changing rather in a qualitative sense, right? Using documents and reporting now possesses a different cultural meaning within journalism than it has possessed in the past, right? So what if the usage of documents and documentary evidence in journalism now has more cultural resonance, has more cultural valence, is seen as a higher, more important form of evidence gathering in journalism than it was previously? What if the usage of documents by journalists has assumed a more central or meaningful place within daily news work? That is sort of my starting point for this talk. So, okay, why documents, right? Pieces of paper, not all that interesting, right? Seem to be fairly commonplace items, right, in the world of journalism today, where we have tweets and Facebook pages and cell phones and, you know, data algorithms and, you know, and all these other wonderful new journalistic tools. Why do we care about things seemingly as mundane as documents? Why are documents something that I'm interested in this talk and then in sort of a bigger research project? So the first answer kind of ties this talk back into my own earlier work. In my first book, which Dan, Networking the News, which Dan mentioned in his introduction, I basically had sort of a very basic but very to me, a very interesting finding that came out of my ethnographic research, which was the main question I was interested in my original ethnographic research was, in a world of vast journalistic change, how do journalists ground their occupational authority? What do they say they do that's different than what your average, ordinary person with a cell phone, man on the street, novelist, you know, what do they do that's different, right? What do they do that makes them special as an occupation? And my finding, for what it's worth, if it can be called anything as grandiose as a finding, but sort of my interesting story I tell, was that journalists ground their authority in the intersection between a certain type of work, and that work is reporting, right? Reporting as conceived in a particular type of way, and reporting in service to and directed at something they call and we call the public, right? Journalists ground their authority in a type of work, reporting, directed at a body, an entity, a public body, the public. That's what journalists do. Yes, all right. And, you know, there you go. That is the you know, so good, I found it. So good, all right. 3 years in Philadelphia. I got it right. 3 years of ethnographic research for that. But, so in my next book, I'm interested then, so if reporting is a key part of this, I'm interested in taking a deeper look at reporting, right? What is that reporting? What does reporting mean? What does it mean to do reporting? And, you know, how is it changing, right? If that is one of the key sources of journalistic authority, how is that act changing, and how are the ways journalists understand that act also changing, right? How does their cultural conception of that activity, how is it changing in the digital age, if at all? By extension, I would also like to look at changing ideas of the public, although that, if I'm lucky enough to get an opportunity, that might wait to a third book, but, you know, one thing at a time. So I'm interested in reporting. So one of the ways to understand reporting, one of the ways I'm interested in understanding reporting, is to look at the raw materials of reporting, right? What are the raw materials, the objects of journalism that go into producing a reported story? What is the iron ore, the raw materials that go into this sort of assemblage we call a completed news story? So I'm interested in looking at the raw materials that make reporting. Among those raw materials, and I'll get to this in a minute, among those raw materials are documents and eventually data, right? Documents and data both are some of the raw materials that go into reporting, although perhaps not important, perhaps more important, but documents are some of these raw materials. So that's reason one. Why documents? Because I think documents have something to say about the way journalists do reporting. Reporting has a lot to say about the cultural authority of journalism as a practice. That's one reason why documents. The second reason, which I've sort of hinted at already, is that understanding documents is sort of a backdoor way or a sneaky side door way of understanding one of the hottest trends in journalism today, which is this thing called data journalism. Or it goes by many names, sort of data journalism, computational journalism, algorithmic journalism. If you hang out with sort of future of news people like I do, if you graduated from a journalism school like I did, if you hang out on Twitter and you see what the sort of future of news gurus are talking about and the things they think are hot and important and interesting, data journalism is at the top of the list, right? Somehow data journalism is going to change journalism in important ways. But data journalism is hard to understand. It's new, or rather it may not be new, but the current, it's actually very old, which is sort of the point of this talk, but the current trendiness or hotness of the topic makes it difficult to wrap one's arm around what exactly data journalism means, right? It's something of a slippery concept to understand, okay, how exactly should we understand what data journalism is? So what if the way we cut into what data journalism is, what if the way that we slice into that question of what data journalism is, okay, don't try to understand the people who do it, okay? Don't try to understand the hacker journalists themselves, right? Hacker, yes, sort of computer scientist journalists. So,
No.
we can talk about why, interestingly, if he wants to jump in later, we can talk about why Phil immediately said no way in the answer to that question. But for now, so one of the things we could do if we wanted were to understand this new breed of people who use data and who use computer science to produce this new form of journalism, data journalism, right? I'm not interested in that. I actually don't want to start with the people. We'll talk about why in a minute. So I don't want to start with the human beings. What if another way to understand it is by the organizations that sort of advocate it, the places where people who do this new form of work get together, the foundations that fund them, the sort of meetups that they have, the cocktail hours they have at conferences like NICAR, right? The ways that they sort of get together and socialize as groups. I think that's also interesting. But again, let's not start with the groups either. So let's not start with the people. Let's not start with the groups. Where to start? Well, what if we understand data journalism by what I call the socio-technical building blocks of data itself? What if we start by the things that build data, the things, not the people or the organization? We start with the way data gets built. In other words, we start with the documents. So let's use documents as our starting point. Right? Now, eventually, I think starting with documents will lead us back to people, and it will lead us back to organizations. I don't think I'm saying people and organizations are not at all involved in this. In fact, I think they are. But let's just try to get at them through understanding the raw materials and the things rather than the people or the groups. Right? Let's just see what happens if we start with the socio-material objects. Why not? If it doesn't work, we can always go back and spend more time with people and more time with the groups. Now, to understand the building blocks of data, right, to understand the things that build data, we don't have to study documents, right? We don't have to. Documents are not the only building blocks of data we could use. We could study people as mediated by short messaging systems, right? People mediated by SMS, right? We could study tweets, right? That's a building block of data, right? We could study the way the public is mediated through web metrics, right? We could study the way that the public gets measured and quantified through measurement tools, right? That's another way we could study the building blocks of data. We don't have to study documents. Documents is one particular type of data building block. But I think that documents are interesting. because they fit nicely into the sociological literature of journalism in two ways. They fit nicely into older studies of journalistic sourcing and studies of news interviews. There is a long tradition of scholarship, especially within news sociology, that studies the journalistic interview as a cultural practice. Scholars like Michael Schudson, Jean Chalabi in France, Rodney Benson in the United States. Sociologists of news have devoted a great amount of time and energy and effort to studying the interview as a form of journalistic evidence. How did the interview emerge? How did it go from being sort of a scandalous practice, that everyone looked down upon, to being the primary way that journalists got their information, right? There's a long history in the literature on the news interview. And so, as we'll see in a minute, expanding our purview to understanding documents fits nicely. It's related to that tradition, but it's different enough that you can sort of have some nice literature synergies there. So that's one reason. Another reason to study documents is that studying documents fits in with newer trends, newer scholarly endeavors and efforts, which are basically these newer studies that focus on the materiality of cultural practice. There is a sort of return to materiality in sociology and studies of culture, right? And a lot of this has been carried on in fields like science and technology studies, sort of the materiality of laboratories, the materiality of libraries, right? Bringing concepts of cultural materiality back into sociology, right? So a refocus on tangible stuff. That's sort of a newer trend within scholarly literature. So I think that by studying documents as the building blocks of journalistic evidence, of data, sort of fit nicely into both older and newer literatures, and they can sort of dialogue with those literatures in a number of ways. Again, obviously people, professions, institutions, and fields are implicated once we begin to talk about documents, right? We don't leave people, professions, institutions, fields behind. But the starting point is different, and a different starting point may lead us to take new angles on our subject. So what I want to do basically is study the raw materials of reporting. That's what I'm interested in, the raw materials of the reporting practices. Okay, so what are these raw materials of reporting? And I've alluded to them already, and I'm going to be somewhat glossing over, highly complicated things here. But what does it mean to say that we want to understand the raw materials of reporting? One way to ask this question is, what objects of evidence do journalists themselves consider to be the raw materials of reporting? Right? What do journalists historically consider to be the primary materials by which they construct news stories? And historically, I would argue, if you sort of open up, at Columbia, they had this thing called RW1, which was the introductory course to all journalism at Columbia. I'm sure you all have your introductory journalism courses here. If you look at an introductory journalism textbook, basically what it will tell you is journalists primarily get their information from three ways. They get them through interviews with sources, they get them through direct first-person observations, and they get them from documents. It's not as simple as that, but if you had to spell it out in 2 seconds, where do journalists get their evidence from? They get them from interviews, first-person observations, and interviews with sources. Like I already said, there is a long tradition of studying interviews. I think you could also get some really interesting research done on understanding journalistic first-person observations. In fact, Barbie Zelizer and John Durham Peters, who are both scholars of news, have talked a lot about witnessing as a journalistic concept. So those two things have been done. I'm interested in. All right, let's talk about documents. So those are the traditional classic forms of evidence, right? Documents, interviews with sources, and direct first-person observations. But perhaps there are changes on the horizon. Perhaps there are new things that journalists are starting to build into their news production practices. We have new forms of journalistic evidence. We have new raw materials and new, what I call new news objects. I'll get to what I mean by new news objects in a minute. And we have new uses of old news objects, right? We have new granular material things that are being packaged into and assembled into journalistic stories in new ways, right? So how are those impacting the news production process? What are these news objects that I'm talking about here. Whoop. I don't want to put that up yet. What are these new news objects? How can we understand, from a theoretical point of view, what's in our theoretical toolkit that will help us ask interesting questions about documents, data, and the raw materials of reporting, right? What can we draw upon from our theoretical toolkit that will allow us to ask interesting questions about these documents? Okay, we've decided we're interested in documents, right? But what is there to say about them that might be at all interesting? What theoretical apparatus can we draw upon? I come from the school of thought that theory's primary role is to help you ask interesting questions. It is not to serve as sort of a social explanation, sort of a pragmatic school of thought on the role of theory. I find theory as something that helps you ask interesting questions. So what theory can we draw upon that helps us ask interesting questions about the raw materials of reporting? I think that one of the things that our theory can help us do is understand documents and data as what I call artifacts. Documents and data as artifacts. So if we start to understand documents and data as artifacts, then we can think about these artifacts in one of three ways, right? So we've got documents, we've got data. How can theory help us think about this in an interesting way, right? The first way is we can see documents and data as mute artifacts mediated by human cultural practices, right? They're just these things out there, and they only have meaning to the degree that people talk about them, right? Where do artifacts get their meaning? Their meanings are socially constructed, and human beings, in conversation with each other, provide them with the meaning they have, right? Documents are mute, they say nothing, and the only value they really have is what human beings in discourse say about them. That's one theoretical angle we can take on documents. A second angle we can take is that documents are powerful material artifacts that dominate our social understanding of them, right? You could call this the sort of blunt technological deterministic approach, right? They're material, they press on us, they press on our words, they press upon social reality, they're out there, they're things, they just push upon us and force us into sort of various behaviors, various ways of sort of behaving and thinking and acting. I'm generalizing here a lot, so forgive me. But that's a second. This is basic technological determinism, right? Twitter causes revolutions. Facebook makes us, have new relationships with our friends in all sorts of ways. I mean, this is unfair, but this is a second view, right? We can think about documents the same way, right? Documents are material. They are powerful material artifacts that dominate our social understanding of them. A third view, however, of artifacts, and the one I'm most interested in, is that you see them as things that talk. In other words, their meaning comes from the intersection between their being material and their being talked about, right? So documents don't simply do whatever they want. They don't press upon us. They don't make us do things, right? They are material. But their value also occurs insofar as how we talk about them, right? They're both, right? They're not either or. And there's a great quote by Lorraine Daston in a book she's written called Things That Talk. Lorraine Daston is a science and technology studies scholar. She's worked with Peter Gallison in a fantastic book called Objectivity, talking about objectivity in science. For those of you journalists out there, journalism professors, journalism students, it's actually a great book. I would highly recommend reading it. It talks about the big bugaboo of journalism, objectivity, but from the point of view of science. That's Daston and Galliston. Anyway, in this other book, Lorraine Daston basically says one very interesting and I think very important, profound thing, which is that she basically says artifacts do not speak for themselves, but neither are they simply spoken for, right? Their meaning lies somewhere in the middle. Okay, so look, I admit all this to this point has been very abstract, right? It's been a little out there. So what do we actually want to learn? What am I interested in here? What do I want to learn? I want to learn one. What are journalistic practices with regard to documents? What are the practices journalists have undertaken with regards to working with, understanding, and compiling documents and using them to produce journalistic work. What are journalistic practices with regard to documents? 2, I want to put these practices into history. I don't simply want to talk about journalists' cultural understanding of documents in 2012. I want to understand, how did they think about documents in 1979? How did they think about documents in 1912? How did they think about documents in 1848, right? How has journalists' historical relationship with documents changed over time? And I think that by combining practices and history, I'm aiming for a 3-dimensional understanding of document culture in journalism. This is what I'm interested in, right? What is document culture in journalism? Let's take these practices and put them into the scope of history. And by understanding document culture, like I said, through the back door, I think we can gain an understanding of data culture in journalism, right? In sort of a sneaky way. We can kind of sneak up on the question that way. Okay, so let's get granular. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. I think in particular case studies, we now need to move this into the realm of case studies. I think in case studies, we need to go beyond what I've done up till this point, which is simply this kind of abstract talk about documents, right? Maybe with a capital D, right? Very Nietzschean, right? Caps and, for these, vague words, right? Let's get beyond documents with a capital D. Let's talk about exactly which documents. Let's start getting specific here. What documents are we talking about? Which documents? So I'm interested in, at this point, 3 sets. I could expand upon those, change them, move them around. Perhaps after today, Phil will tell me that the documents used in stories about Detroit for precision journalism, that's not the way to go. But maybe for now I've got 3. What are the 3? I'm interested in the documentary data sets used in early 20th century progressive use of statistics, right? I'm going to talk about this in a second, and how that early progressive era use of documents and statistics informed journalistic practices in the early 20th century. That's one. There are actual data sets there, data sets of a very interesting kind. 2, I'm interested in government records as they were used by early practitioners of precision journalism and then computer-assisted reporting, right? How are those used 60 years later, right? When things like CAR and precision journalism were first being formulated, theorized, and used. And 3, I'm interested in something called the Overview Project, which is a current sort of mass data analysis project with the AP. One of the corpuses of documents they have analyzed have been the WikiLeaks cables, right? So let's get granular. We don't want to talk about documents as an ontological category, but rather as a specific cluster of particular things, right? So I want to talk about 3 eras, and I mentioned those already, right? 3 eras. I want to talk about 3 processes that occurred in those eras, and I want to talk about 3 emergent, what I call thick understandings of artifacts. 3 by 3 by 3. Talk about each one of those for a minute now. Okay, let's talk about the 3 eras. First era, let's start in the early 20th century. We have, and this is a whole other talk in and of itself, but in the early progressive era, we start to see the emergence of statistics. We start to see the emergence of what I would call big data. People first started talking about big data, believe it or not, in the early 20th century. You would have these things called social survey. I'm curious, has anyone here ever heard of the social survey movement, or anyone here know what that is? Good, it means I can put this in the book, because it will be new. The social survey movement was kind of the original practice of big data, right? Early 20th century, there are no government agencies that keep large mass records of any kind, right? There aren't these government agencies that track these things. There's the census. That's largely it, right? So the early groups and the groups in the early progressive era decide one of the ways they're going to enact social reform is by counting things, right? You want to reform the factories. How do you reform working conditions in the factories? One way to reform working conditions in the factories is that you understand what's going on in the factories. What they did was they sent teams of volunteers into places like Pittsburgh who went through and who counted every factory worker in Pittsburgh. Their case histories, whether they'd been involved in accidents, what their working conditions were like, how they got paid, right? They would do this in a number of social areas. They would compile them into huge books, right? Books, the records of the city, right? They would produce multiple volumes, 12 or 13 volumes. This was called the social survey movement, and you could argue that this was sort of this was statistics via a sort of primitive and kind of neat version of what I like to call big data, right? This was the original big data, right? Let's go into the factories and just count people and things. For our purposes, this is really interesting, and if I had more time, I would spend more time on this. But the social survey movement not only did counting itself, but it liaisoned with the urban press in really interesting ways. They actually had PR representatives whose job it was not only to publicize their social movement, but publicize the data they collected, right? Work with the newspapers to publicize this big data through news stories. And not only through news stories, they partnered with news organizations to set up an early version of infographics, right? We all know what infographics are. They actually work with news organizations to build the early 20th century version of infographics. They would rent out space in department stores and in urban centers. They'd have these giant statistical sort of visualizations of the statistics they had collected, right? So we even see infographics here. So that's one era, all right? Second era, precision journalism and computer-assisted reporting. We have the founder of precision journalism in the audience, which makes me somewhat nervous to talk about it, but I'm going to anyway. I think this is a second sort of key moment that you can plug into in the emergence and the sort of ontology of documents in journalism. Basically, with precision journalism, we see the growing use of empirical social science techniques in the analysis of documents, right? We see a certain way of understanding documents by applying social science techniques directly to them. And I think you could also argue that this movement emerged out of a growth in accessibility of public records databases, right? Public databases were accessible, openable, and reachable in ways that they had not been up till this point, right? Second era, second moment. So the first moment is man and religion forward, social survey movement. Second moment, precision journalism, computer-assisted reporting. Third moment, talk a little bit about data journalism today. I don't have a ton of time, so I can come back to this in the question and answer. But we have sort of moved. We are no longer in the sort of social survey movement. We are in an evolution of the computer-assisted reporting movement. We have a growth in what people now talk about as data journalism. You'll see right here, this is a screen cap from something called the Overview Project. Without getting into the weeds of what the Overview Project is, it is a project being run through the AP by computer scientists at the Associated Press. What they let you do is basically, say you get the WikiLeaks cables, right? 40,000 documents or so, more than that. But say you get a giant batch of documents, right? What if there was a way to do machine learning and machine-based analysis that allowed you to cluster those documents in ways that told you what they were about and what sort of topics they clustered around without you ever having read them, right? And that's what this, and if you can see it, it's very small, but that's what this basically is, right? This is a clustering of the WikiLeaks cables, right? So if something talks about Iraq, basically the machine reads it, understands it, and clusters it for you. And what this allows you to do is it allows clusters to emerge that may not be related to journalistic questions you already had, right? Normally, when you analyze documents, what do? You do a keyword search, right? You look for a certain topic, right? You want to study Iraq documents, you look for contractors. You look for suicide bombers. But what if something emerged out of this algorithmic clustering through this analysis of documents that was not a question you knew to ask at all, right? This is the basic premise of the Overview Project. Now, it sounds like a magical tool that will do, everything we could ever want, but it's interesting in a lot of ways, and one of the ways is the number of hacks, the number of sort of negotiations with the data set that the lead programmers on this project had to undergo. It was a torturous process to get these pieces of paper to talk to them. It's actually very hard. What were one of the things that were hard? One of the things that was hard was that all of these government cables come with cover sheets, right? Cover sheets totally screw up the clustering analysis. They're not in the same format as the rest of the documents, right? You've got this cover sheet, and they've got kind of standardized text. So the cover sheet itself completely messes up the entire analysis. You then have to go back in and build a script that will somehow extract the cover sheet from the document analysis itself. And there's all sorts of steps to this process that, make this a much more complicated and interesting process than simply putting documents in a magical machine that then sort them for you, right? The way the computer scientists and the programmer journalists have dealt with this is really interesting and can be analyzed in all sorts of ethnographic and qualitative ways. Okay, those are the 3 eras, real quickly, because I think I'm probably running out of time. 3 eras. Next, 3 processes. I think we take these eras, then what are the processes we can analyze that will allow us to gain insight into the relationship between reporters and documents? What are the processes we want to look at? These are pretty simple, but it's useful to have categories when you're dealing with a project this big. First, we can look at the process by which documents are collected, right? In each era, arguably, these documents are collected, initially gathered in different ways, right? Even if we go outside these eras, we can still look at differences in the way the documents themselves are gathered. 2, we can look at the way the documents are analyzed, right? In each era, the documents go through different processes of analysis, right? One is sort of big data accounting. Another is social science and statistics. The third way is sort of algorithmic analysis, right? Based on automated machine learning and computation, right? Again, I'm not wedded to any of this, but I'm looking for insights. I'm looking for ways to cut into this that help this become a manageable research project. The way documents are analyzed. And third, the way the results are displayed, right? We have this analysis. How are the results themselves displayed? How are they sort of broadcast and put out there to the public? Okay, here's the big payoff. The payoff. Do I have? I do. Okay. Payoff. What will all this give us? It will give us really big things if we follow it through. 1, I think it will tell us how journalists have understood time, right? Using documents in a certain way and getting certain results out of documents implies a certain journalistic conception of time. If we are looking at a massive set of documents that cover a wide historical period, the resulting story may conceive of news time in a different way. Maybe it's not simply what happened yesterday, right? Maybe it's what happened the past year, and now we can summarize it in a particular new way. This is getting closer to social science, I think, right? It's thinking of time in social scientific terms rather than deadline-driven journalistic terms. So maybe there are new understandings we can get here of time. I told you this was big stuff. Next thing, space, right? But again, right, understanding the way documents have been processed and analyzed gives us different understanding of how journalists have conceived space, right? Understanding, looking at documents as gathered through census data, right, gives us a different understanding of what journalists consider to be public space, right? The space about which they're reporting than other ways, right? We can think about the way journalists have thought about space and the way the public occupies space in different ways. Third, narrative, right? The way journalists have turned these into visualizations and stories can possibly give us insights into the different ways they narrativize both documents and data. Maybe the stories they tell are different. Maybe the relationship between data and story is different or new, or maybe it's all always the same, right? Which is also interesting. All this basically takes us to this nice little summary matrix here, which is the eras, social survey movement, precision journalism, and the overview project, the different practices within those eras, collection, analysis, display, helps us understand concepts of time, space, and narrative that are articulated between the artifacts, the thing themselves, and the profession that's making use of those things. All right. Concluding questions of a self-critical nature. This is new for me, and I'm interested in hearing if you guys have any thoughts on this or on anything else that we talked about today. First question. Are you guys familiar with something called a Whig history? Has anybody here ever heard the phrase Whig history before? Whig history is basically a way of thinking about history that sees history as the gradual unfolding. It's sort of like Candide, right? History is the gradual unfolding of a positive forward movement where everything is getting better and better all the time. And partly it's getting better because we have new and better technology, right? That is sort of a Whig history. And while I think that may be one of the stories going on in this analysis of documents, I would really not want it to be most of or really all of what I'm talking, or at the most a small part of what I'm talking about. Right? Obviously, journalists' understanding of what they do, who they are, has changed. The technology has changed. But I don't want to simply tell a story of, well, back in the early 20th century, we were kind of primitive and we just counted a lot of stuff. And now in 2012, we have computers and it sorts things. And, life is way better now than it was 100 years ago. There are contradictions within these processes. There are histories that get avoided. There are stories that get left out. There are processes that are overlooked. There are paths forward that are not taken, right? There are arguments amongst the people who were involved where someone won the argument and someone lost, right? I want to make sure I hold on to these and don't simply tell sort of the great, wonderful, positive unfolding of, kind of journalism that's better now than it ever has been before. So that's self-critical question 1. Can you avoid this in a study like this? 2. How do we avoid focusing only on the outlier exceptions, right? Things like the overview project. The overview project is not being used in every newsroom, right? It's not being used in any. Precision journalism was important, CAR was important, but it was certainly not the dominant form of journalistic work ever, right? It's not what the majority of journalists do the majority of the time. They do other things. So is there a problem in focusing on the outliers or the exceptions or sort of these unusual, maybe odd moments and missing this sort of banality of the actual practices and the banality of the actual history? And related to that, the third question is, how do we understand the relationship between what the dominant practices are and practices that may have central professional value but are not dominant, right? So what if the overview project is never the dominant form of journalistic practice, right? But what if it grows to possess a certain positive cultural value in journalism that make it one of the best things, right? Even if it's not the most common thing. What if it becomes seen as the gold standard, right? What is the relationship between the stuff news reporters do all the time, the stuff journalists do all the time, and sort of these exceptional practices and forms of work? It's always rough to conclude a talk on sort of undermining or criticizing your own argument you've made for the past 45 minutes, but this should nicely lead us into questions and conversation. When do we end, Dan? What's our official ending time?
3, so
Okay, 15 minutes. We can go longer if folks have other stuff they want to talk about, or I am happy to meet with folks afterward. So this is it. Again, I thank you all for bearing with me. I apologize again for there's no no actual findings here yet, but hopefully this is the beginning of some interesting questions and some ways of thinking about this moment in which there's this potentially major change in the way that journalism, right, which contributes to our empirical understanding of reality, right? We are looking at possible major changes in the cultural practice that helps us as citizens in a democracy understand what is actually going on in the world. And if these practices are changing, then potentially very many other important things are changing as well. And if they're not changing, that's almost as interesting, right? So thank you. It's been really great talking, and I'm interested to hear any questions you might have. Bill.
I have an idea for you.
Yes, great.
Feel free to pass it off as your own.
Okay.
Walter Lippmann, writing in the 1920s about what you call the social survey movement, mentioned nations keeping statistics on infant mortality.
Right.
And as soon as any country began keeping track of infant mortality started going down.
Yep.
He said it's just as though those babies had an alderman to represent them because these statistics made it visible. Maybe that's another definition for your study. Maybe in each of those three phases, you can show how the change in journalism, the change in information, changes the world.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, and Michael Schudson, who is a great scholar of Walter Lippmann, my advisor, I think has touches on interesting, similar things, right? I do think that, and I agree with you. I think Lippmann is Lippmann is sort of the forerunner of all this, right? I mean, Lippmann, was the guy who was sort of halfway between social scientist, journalist, and pundit, right? So yeah, fourth category certainly of what are the actual real world consequences of this sort of use of documents or this use of data, I think would be fantastic. Well, I will appropriately give credit for that idea. So thanks. Yeah.
When you look at in your program the analysis of the WikiWeek documents and so forth, the people analyzing that had no input. They relied on the document.
Well,
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
About that.
This is so you're sort of getting at one of the most interesting. The most interesting moments in all of this. No, that's a perfect question. The people who had input were the programmers themselves, right? The ultimate output of the algorithmic process was this sort of hybrid between the algorithm itself and the values and expectations that the programmers encoded in that algorithm, right? So when they programmed it, they had certain values, certain beliefs, and certain things they wanted to find. Certain ways they thought evidence was, accurate and not accurate. Certain understandings of what truth was and what truth was not. Right? And so all that is embedded in the program itself. Right? It's not simply that that's all it was. Right? So one of the interesting things you've got going on here is there are values embedded in this program. There are sort of occupational values embedded in this program, but they are as much the values of computer programmers as they are as journalists. Right? So you sort of have particular values of particular organizational groups being smuggled into the software itself. And the potentially dangerous moment in all this is that algorithms and computational practices, as sort of I think came out in my talk, are often portrayed as entirely free of human input. Right? They're just the output of a machine. And I think that is as true, if not more true, in computer science than in anything else. Now, computer scientists know this is not true, right? Computer scientists know that their values, beliefs, and cultural practices get sort of encoded in these algorithms and these, computer programmers. But we as social scientists, the popular culture at large, sometimes journalists, look at these algorithms and look at these computational devices and just say, oh, well, it's just a program. It's objective. It produces truth. When in reality it produces sort of a hybrid of truth and belief, with the percentages of each kind of up for argument and debate and sort of analysis, I guess. That's a great question. Yeah?
So you mentioned that there aren't any, I guess, findings or whatever. So how long do you see yourself researching this? And
Right.
when will you know for yourself, like, all right,
this is finished? Yeah. So this is my next. I hope this is my next book project. I think well, when will I know it's done? I don't know when I'll know it's done. I mean, I think that what I'm going to try to do is sort of have a shallow dive into each of the three eras, right? So not just take one era and see it through to the very end, but sort of do a shallow dive in each of the three and see, spend some time in the archives, spend some time for the current, overview project, spend some time doing ethnographic work, spend some time doing qualitative analysis, just a little bit of time in each. See, okay, is this going to work, right? Is the data here, is this going to become something more than me simply, saying whatever I think is true, and, is there actual material here? If there is, I would like to sort of have an introduction done. Those would be the three main data chapters, and then there would be, some sort of wrap-up and conclusion. I think that each one of the topics probably would need Ideally, they would need a year, so I could see this being a 3 or 4 year project. It's a very risky proposition because there's no hypothesis, right? And there's no, there's no sort of, well, I'll find this or I won't find it. And it could ultimately be a complete waste of time. But I think that the way you keep these sorts of projects from being waste of time is to ask interesting questions. And if you can ask interesting questions, then the answers will always be interesting, even if on the face of it the answers are very dull. It's not really a real answer. 3 or 4 years, I don't know. Depends on what my tenure committee, wants. Yeah.
Did you find the journalists in the newsroom very thoughtful about these issues, that document, and they think a lot about it?
No.
They don't.
They don't, although they do at certain times. They do when they are confronted with new technologies. So they, journalists most of the time engage in routine practices where they rarely think about what they're doing. They have a story to get out. But they think about them when they are confronted with sort of new technological artifacts, when they're confronted with new story problems. There's sort of these critical moments where they're forced to kind of grapple with something that's new or articulate their understanding of something that's new. The other thing you have to not really count as valid ethnographic data for this is that you can't trust what journalists say in conferences or in panel talks. Because they're pretending, and they are simply saying what they know the audience wants them to say. Largely, I have found as many years of ethnographic research that what journalists say in panel talks and at journalism conferences are almost always more interesting and more sort of future-oriented than what journalists actually do in the newsroom most of the time. So it's sort of a tricky, you sort of have to avoid that trap of going to journalism conferences and asking journalists and hearing what they say, and then actually taking that as a substitute for what's actually going on in a newsroom. There's not really always a relationship there. When I first started my ethnographic research, I'd spent a lot of time at journalism conferences. So I had this, and no time in the newsroom at all. And so I thought, well, they're going to be doing all these things. They're going to be saying this, and they're going to be blogging and tweeting, and they were doing almost none of those things. So that was sort of a lesson I learned pretty early on.
Not blogging, not tweeting?
Not when I was there, no. They were producing typical regular news stories the way journalists had produced typical regular news stories, at least since Herb Gans, visited them in the 60s and probably before then.
Sounds a lot like professors.
Well, yeah. We're set in our ways. Is there a hand back there? No, I thought I saw. Oh, yes. Hey, hello, Zainab.
What you thought about this new artifact, which is the intermediation and the data sets that produce, right? We've never had, this is like 5-10 years thing, right? We've never had this much interaction that's mediated in these large data sets.
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple of interesting journalistic projects regarding the CKY project.
Yep.
I mean, it is a new kind of artifact. I don't think you can put it in a lot of context, but I don't think you can get away from the fact that it's pretty novel, both in its scope and what it documents.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing a lot of discussion about this among journalists. Columbia now has this dual computer science journalism class.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because to get at this data, you kind of need to be able to program nowadays. Maybe that will change.
Right.
Where do you put all of this? How do you respond to new artifacts?
I mean, so I think 2 ways. I mean, one of the ways to respond to a new artifact is to historicize its emergence, right? And one can both appreciate that and find that as something that unfairly limits the novelty of what's actually occurring. I think that's what you're getting at, right? Through historicization, you can occasionally err on the side of not seeing the truly, truly new in what's happening. It is shaking stuff up. So the second way I would answer that is, even with a very new artifact, and even with a very new set of processes which cluster around that artifact, there are still alternative conceptions of that artifact, and there are still alternative practices that are not embraced, that are silenced, that are sort of seen as illegitimate, even within the sort of changing field. So I think that then, sort of focuses a refractory light upon that new artifact, right? By not to be critical for the sake of being critical, but to be, critical in a way that helps you get a multidimensional view of the artifact and the practices. With the Columbia Journalism Engineering degree, there are certain ways that dual degree could unfold. There are sort of many paths that dual degree could take. And they're not all going to be taken. It's going to be limited in particular ways. And so the question then is how and why and to what ends and, what were the factors.
They currently have 5 majors now.
Yeah, and right, and they're worried that they're all going to not actually. So Columbia has a joint computer science journalism degree. The professors at Columbia are all very paranoid that nobody's actually going to finish the degree. They're all simply going to get hired away by Google, like halfway through. This is, legitimate concern. Two more questions, I guess, or one more question. Anybody? Or maybe no? Yes.
With a lot of digital documents and interviews being conducted over the internet and stuff like that, how do you verify the authenticity of a lot of these files? If you're analyzing the WikiLeaks cables, for example, and there's 100 fake cables that are inserted in there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak from the point of view of the people actually doing the work with the Overview project or with other places. So one thing is that they have become, I think, unreasonably reliable on data sets, not entirely, WikiLeaks is an exception, but unreasonably reliable on data sets that the government chooses to make public, right? So large databases that the government itself strategically often chooses to let out to the world. That solves the authenticity problem, right? And journalists like it because it somewhat solves the authenticity problem, but it often means you're dealing with a corpus of data that the government thinks, is fine to be analyzed and quantified and looked at in all these ways. So that's one answer. The other answer is that even within something like the Overview project, the findings, what the algorithm tells them, is always triangulated by traditional interviewing of regular journalistic sources, right? So maybe the Overview algorithm tells you something new that you didn't know. Maybe it comes out of this cluster of 100 very bizarre, odd documents that you didn't expect to find. You then go to your national security correspondent's regular source for doing these sorts of stories, and you say, hey, Mr. State Department official, how does this seem to you? Does this seem like this holds water? Does this seem like, this is actually going on? And they can often, chime in on, whether, that sort of finding seems authentic. So it's not a perfect way of sussing this out, but it is a way to sort of bring human beings back into the process that can allow you to sort of have some verifiability on things that may seem strange.